Miss Marple and the Widow Who Forgot to Die. Welcome to Cafe Tales, my friends. I'm Ali, and it truly warms me heart to see you joining me again this evening. I'd love to know where you are listening from, and did you have a peaceful day? Share it in the comments, and remember to subscribe for a new mystery every day. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Widow Returns. The morning was one of those deceptively pleasant October mornings that St. Mary Mead did so well. A thin mist hung over churchyard, and the chrysanthemums in the cottage gardens glowed with an almost defiant cheerfulness against the approaching winter. Miss Jane Marple, making her way along the high street with her string shopping bag and sensible walking shoes, paused to admire Mrs. Beckham's dahlias, which really were quite spectacular this year. She had just decided that a few more items were needed for her modest larder, when she noticed the unusual silence that had fallen over the village shop. The bell above the door had tinkled as Sumian entered just before her, but the normal cheerful chatter that accompanied such entrances had given way to Sumian Greva different. Miss Marple, whose hearing was excellent despite her 70 years, detected a quality in that silence that put her immediately on alert. It was the silence of shock. Miss Marple entered the shop with a customary gentle smile, nodding to young Mrs. Clement, who stood frozen behind the counter, her mouth slightly open. The tin of biscuits she had been holding lay on the floor, its contents scattered across the worn wooden boards like so many fallen leaves. And there, examining a shelf of flour with apparent unconcern, stood Mrs. Eleanora Drayton. Miss Marple felt a small, cold sensation at the base of her spine. It was not unpleasant, merely interesting. She had felt it before, when something in the natural order of village life had been disturbed. Mrs. Eleanora Drayton, after all, had been dead these past 3 months. The identification had been quite positive a boating accident off the coast near Dover. The body had been in the water for some days. Naturally, but her solicitor, Mr. Ashby, had made the formal identification. There had been the funeral, the will read, the cottage passed to her nephew. All very sad, but these things happened. Mrs. Drayton had been a pleasant woman, rather reserved, who had come to St. Mary Mead some 5 years ago after her husband's death. She had kept to herself, attended church regularly, and bothered no one. And now she stood in the village shop, very much alive, wearing a neat brown coat and aratha, smart hat with a small feather. Miss Marple moved quietly to the side, ostensibly examining the tins of soup, but positioned so that she could observe without appearing to stare. It was a technique she had perfected over many years, and one that had served her well. People revealed so much when they thought themselves unobserved. Mrs. Clement finally found her voice, though it emerged as little more than a whisper. Mrs. Drayton, but we thought that is, we were told. Eleanora Drayton turned, and Miss Marple studied her face with the same attention she might give to an unfamiliar plant in her garden. The woman smiled, but there was something tentative about it, as though she were trying on an expression to see if it fit. "I know it must be quite a shock," Mrs. Drayton said. Her voice was pleasant, cultivated, with that careful precision that spoke of someone who had learned to speak properly, rather than being born to it. "I can hardly believe it myself, but I survived. You see, I was thrown clear of the boat, and I managed to reach the shore. A fishing family took me in, but I had lost memory entirely. It has only just begun to return these past few weeks." It was a remarkable story. Miss Marple thought of young Johnny Wells, who had fallen from a tree and lost all memory of the incident, but none of his knowledge of who he was or where he lived. Memory was such an interesting thing, convenient, too, when one wished to explain an absence. "How wonderful," Miss Marple said gently. "Mrs. Drayton, what a blessing that you survived. We were all so very sorry to hear of your accident." Eleonora Drayton's eyes met hers, and for just a moment Miss Marple saw some weaving flicker in their depths. Recognition, perhaps, or was it weariness? "Thank you, Miss Marple." Jane Marple. "We met once at the church fete. I Believaux were admiring the roses." "Of course, Mrs. Drayton," she said, though her smile suggested she remembered nothing of the kind. "How kind of you. I am afraid Mamma is still rather patchy. The doctors say it may take some time to fully recover." "The doctors," Miss Marple repeated softly. "You have been in hospital then?" A brief hesitation. "A small clinic in Kent. They were very kind, but when my Marie began to return, I knew I must come home to St. Mary Mead." She turned back to Mrs. Clement. "I shall need Fleur, if you please, and perhaps some tea. I find the cottage rather empty of provisions." Mrs. Clement, still looking dazed, began to gather the items with shaking hands. Miss Marple watched as Eleonora Drayton moved about the shop, her steps confident, her manner that of some eminently comfortable in her surroundings, not at all like someone who had nearly drowned, who had suffered amnesia, who had been living with strangers for months. And then Miss Marple's gaze fell upon Mrs. Drayton. They were brown leather, good quality, with a modest heel, and they were new, not merely polished, but genuinely new. The soles showed almost no wear at all, and the leather had fat, stiff, unbent quality of shoes that had been worn perhaps twice, no more. Miss Marple thought of her nephew Raymond's hiking boots after his walking tour of the Lake District, the mud, the scuffs, the worn-down heels. She thought of Mrs. Allerton's shoes after she claimed to have walked all the way from the station with her heavy luggage. The dust had told its own story. A woman who had washed ashore, who had lived with a fishing family, who had only just begun to travel again, would not have pristine shoesless. Of course, she had purchased them very recently. But then, where had she obtained the money? Her accounts had been closed, her assets distributed. It was all very curious. Mrs. Clement wrapped the packages with trembling fingers. "Will you be staying at the cottage then?" "I mean, your nephew, Mr. Harford, he's been living there since the will was settled." A shadow crossed Eleonora Drayton's face. "Has he indeed? Well, I suppose arrangements will need to be made, but it is still my cottage, after all." There was steel beneath the pleasant tone. Miss Marple made a mental note of it. She herself had once known two sisters who had quarrelled over a cottage in Much Benham. The elder had died in a fall from the attic stairs. Such a tragic accident, everyone had said. But Miss Marple had noticed the carpet rod that should have been at the top of the stairs had been moved to the bottom. Small things, but telling. "Mr. Ashby, your solicitor, will be able to help sort everything out," Mrs. Clement ventured. "He is the one who identified it is. He handled all the arrangements." Mrs. Drayton's expression became quite blank. "Mr. Ashby, yes, of course. I shall have to call upon him." She gathered her packages and moved toward the door. Miss Marple held it open for her, noting, as she did so, the faint scent of French perfume, not English lavender or rosewater, but something more sophisticated, something that might be purchased in Paris or along the Riviera. "Thank you," Mrs. Drayton murmured, and then she was gone, walking briskly up the high street toward the edge of the village where Bluebell Cottage stood. Miss Marple let the door close gently. Mrs. Clement had sunk on Teith's stool behind the counter. fanning herself with a copy of the parish magazine. Chapter 2. A Death on Paper. The news of Mrs. Eleanor Rodgerton's resurrection spread through St. Mary Mead with the speed and inevitability of autumn rain. By afternoon tea, there was scarcely a household that had not discussed it, and by evening the theories had multiplied like mushrooms after a storm. Miss Marple heard most of them during her afternoon visit to Miss Hartnell, who had invited several ladies for tea and could not resist the opportunity to dissect this most extraordinary. Miss Hartnell herself favoured the romantic theory of amnesia brought on by shock and exposure. Mrs. Price inclined toward the view Tharthor had been a mistake in the identification. Young Mrs. Dane, who read rather to many novels, suggested darkly that perhaps Mrs. Drayton had staged her own death to escape some terrible danger. Miss Marple listened to it all with her pleasant, vague smile and said very little. She was thinking about Mr. Clement Ashby, the solicitor who had identified the body 3 months ago. Mr. Ashby was a careful man. She had observed him at church committee meetings, noting the way he examined every penny spent, every contract signed. He was not the sort of person who made mistakes about important matters, such as identifying the dead. He had known Mrs. Drayton for years, had handled her late husband's will, had been entrusted with her own affairs. And yet, if the woman now walking about St. Mary Mead was indeed Eleanora Drayton, then Mr. Ashby had been catastrophically wrong. That evening, after returning home and attending to her small supper, Miss Marple settled into her chair by the window. It overlooked the street, and she had long ago perfected the art of observing Wood appearing to do so. A strategically placed lamp and the angle of her chair meant that she could see out quite clearly while remaining largely invisible to passers-by. She was worded just after 8 o'clock by the sight of Mr. Ashby himself walking with unusual speed toward the High Street. His normal gait was measured and deliberate, but tonight he moved with the urgency of a man who had received distressing news. His face, illuminated briefly by the street lamp, wore an expression of profound anxiety. Miss Marple considered this. Mr. Ashby would naturally have heard about Mrs. Drayton's return by now. The question was, what such news meant to him. Relief that she was alive. Confusion about or something else entirely. She thought of Albert Grimes, the village clerk in Much Benham, who had embezzled parish funds and then discovered that the one person who could expose him had not died in a train accident after all, but had merely been delayed. Poor Albert had aged 10 years in 10 minutes when his supposed victim walked through the door. The next morning brought rain, the soft, persistent kind that turned the village paths to mud and gave everything a melancholy grey aspect. Miss Marple was considering whether to venture out for her morning constitutional when young Constable Perkins appeared at her door, looking pale and considerably shaken. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his shalmet and standing awkwardly on her doorstep, "I am afraid I have some rather shocking news. Mr. Ashby, the solicitor, has been found dead in his office." Miss Marple felt that small cold sensation again, stronger this time. "Dead, but I saw him only last evening. He appeared quite well, if somewhat agitated. His clerk found him this morning when he came to open up. Mr. Ashby was slumped over his desk. Dr. Haydock says it looks like heart failure, but given the circumstances..." He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Given that Mrs. Drayton has returned from the dead, you mean?" Miss Marple replied gently. "Yes, I quite see. May I ask, Constable, whether you observed anything unusual in Mr. Ashby's office?" Constable Perkins shifted his... "Well, I am not certain I should be discussing the details, Miss Marple, but seeing as you have been helpful in the past and seeing as this might be nothing more than natural causes. Hep then continued in a lower voice. There was a paper on his desk, blank checked for what looked like the impression of a letter. Just one initial, really the letter E. An impression, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully, as though something had been written on a page above it, and the pressure of the pen left its mark. Just so, Miss Marple, and his ink bottle was shattered on the floor. Looked as though it might have been knocked over in some kind of disturbance, though Dr. Haydock says, when the heart gives out a person can thrash about quite violently. Miss Marple considered this. She thought of old Colonel Bantry, who had died of heart failure in his study. There had been no knocked-over bottles, no scattered papers. He had simply slumped forward very quietly, as though falling asleep. But then, every case was different. "Thank you for informing me, Constable," she said. "I suppose Mrs. Drayton has been told. I'm on my way there now, Miss Marple. Not a pleasant duty, but it must be done." After he left, Miss Marple put on her mackintosh and her sensible rain hat. The weather was no deterrent to someone who wished to observe, and there was much to observe this morning. Mr. Ashby's office was situated above the chemist shop on High Street. Already a small crowd had gathered, speaking in hushed tones. Miss Marple joined them, listening carefully to the various accounts. Mr. who had the bookshop next door, had heard nothing unusual during the night. The office had been locked when the clerk arrived at 9 o'clock, and Hayhod used his own key to enter. Dr. Haydock emerged as Miss Marple stood there, looking tired and rather grim. He nodded to her. "A bad business, Miss Marple. I would say heart failure, but circumstances are peculiar. A man does not generally work late into the night if he's feeling unwell. He was working late. Then the clerk says Mr. Ashby sent him home at the usual time, said he had some important matters to attend to. That would have been around 6 o'clock. Miss Marple absorbed this important matters, and only 2 hours later, Mr. Ashby had been walking rapidly through the village, his face drawn with worry. Was there any sign of disturbance apart from the ink bottle? Dr. Haydock gave her a sharp look. "Constable Perkinshaw's been talking, I see. Well, there is no harm in your knowing." The office was neat enough, but his safe was slightly up and not forced, mind you, but not properly shut, either, as though he had opened it in some haste and neglected to secure it properly. This was very interesting indeed. Miss Marple thanked Dr. Haydock and made her way slowly toward the church, where she knew Constable Perkins would eventually bring Mrs. Drayton. She did not have long to wait. Mrs. Drayton arrived within the half hour, looking appropriately shocked and speaking in a low, distressed voice to the constable. Miss Marple observed them from the church porch where she had taken shelter from the rain. Mrs. Drayton wore the same brown coat as yesterday, but a different hat, this one quite plain. Her face was pale, her hands clasped tightly together. She looked, Miss Marple thought, like a woman who had received disturbing news, but was not entirely surprised by it. Constable Perkins called, spotting her. "Would you mind staying with Mrs. Drayton for a moment? I must speak with the vicar about the arrangements." "Of course," Miss Marple said, moving forward. She guided Mrs. Drayton to a bench inside the church, away from the curious eyes outside. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Mrs. Drayton said in a voice barely above a whisper, "Mr. Ashby identified my body. He was so certain, and now he is dead." "It must be a great shock to you," Miss Marple said gently. "You were planning to call upon him. I believe you mentioned yesterday." Mrs. Drayton's hands twisted in her lap. I did call upon him last evening after I left the shop. I thought it best to sort out the confusion about the will immediately. And what did Mr. Ashby say? A long pause. He was not there. That is, his clerk said he had left for the day. So he returned to the cottage. Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Drayton's gloves were quite new, matching the newness of her shoes. The leather had not yet molded to her hands. Everything about her suggested recent purchase, recent acquisition. And your nephew, Mr. Harford Hemastave, been surprised to see you. He was not at the cottage either. I spent the evening alone, going through my things. So many memories. She said this with an odd flatness. As though speaking lines learned by rote, Miss Marple thought about Mr. Ashby walking rapidly through the village at 8 o'clock. If Mrs. Drayton had found him absent at 6, where had he gone? And more importantly, what had he been doing in his office late that night, opening his safe in apparent haste? I wonder, Miss Marple said, very casually, whether you noticed anything unusual when you returned to the cottage. Any sign that someone else had been there, perhaps? Mrs. Drayton looked at her sharply. Why would you ask such a thing? Oh, no particular reason only, that cottages which have been left empty often attract the curious. In villages, you know, people do talk. I noticed nothing unusual, Mrs. Drayton said firmly. But her fingers had tightened on her gloves, and Miss Marple observed a small tremor in her hands. Constable Perkins returned then, and Miss Marple excused herself. She had learned what she needed to learn. Mrs. Drayton was more than that. She was frightened of something specific, something that Mr. Ashby's death had brought into sharp focus. As Miss Marple walked slowly home through the rain, she thought about wills and inheritances, about bodies in the water, and solicitors who died of convenient heart failure. She thought about the letter E impressed on a blank sheet of paper and a safe left, carelessly open, and a missing file that must have contained something worth killing for. Because Miss Marple was quite certain, despite the Haydock's diagnosis, that Mr. Ashby had not died of natural causes. He had died because he knew something, and whatever he knew, it had been important enough to make someone act with desperate speed. The question now was not who Mrs. Drayton was, but who she was not, and, more pressingly, who wanted to ensure that particular secret remained hidden. Chapter 3. The solicitor's panic. The inquest into Mr. Clement. Ashby's death was held 3 days later in the parish hall, a building that normally hosted jumble sales and amateur theatricals, but now served the rather more sombre purpose of determining how a respected solicitor had come to die alone in his office. Miss Marple attended, as did most of St. Mary Mead. Dr. Haydock gave his evidence in his usual brisk manner. Heart failure brought on by strain and overwork. The heart muscle had been weak. He said, though Mr. Ashby had never consulted me about any symptoms. Still, these things can remain undetected until the fatal moment. The clerk, a nervous young Manomed Patterson, testified that Mr. Ashby had seemed distracted on his final day, perhaps even worried, but that was not unusual given the nature of his work. People came to solicitors with their troubles, after all. Mrs. Eleanora Drayton was not called to testify, as she had not seen Mr. Ashby that evening. Her attempted visit to his office was noted, but as the clerk had already gone home and Mr. Ashby was out, there was nothing to be said about it. The verdict was death by natural causes. Miss Marple listened to it all with her customary air of polite attention, but her mind was occupied with rather different thoughts. She was thinking about the safe in Mr. Ashby's office and what Dr. Haydock had told her about it banged slightly ajar. After the inquest concluded, she made her way to the high street, ostensibly to purchase some wool for a new pair of mittens she was knitting for her great-nephew. The wool shop was conveniently located directly across from the chemist's, which meant she had an excellent view of Mr. Ashby's office windows above. Young Mr. Patterson was there. She could see him moving about through the window, no doubt sorting through his let employer's papers. The business would need to be wound up or transferred to another solicitor. These things took time. Miss Marple was still standing there, apparently absorbed in selecting the proper shade of grey wool, when she saw Constable Perkins emerge from the chemist's entrance and climb their stairs to the office. He remained there for perhaps 20 minutes, then descended again, looking thoughtful. Miss Marple made her purchase and managed to encounter the constable quite by accident as he reached the pavement. "Good morning, Constable. I trust everything is being sorted out satisfactorily at Mr. Ashby's office." Constable Perkins touched his helmet. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Yes, well, as satisfactory as these things can be, though I confess there are one or two small matters that puzzle me still." "Indeed," Miss Marple said encouragingly. The constable glanced around, then lowered his voice. "The thing is, Miss Marple, I have been going through Mr. Ashby's safe more carefully, his personal papers, you understand, to see if there were any instructions for his own affairs. And I noticed something curious." "How interesting?" "There are folders for all his clients, you see, alphabetically arranged, but there is a gap. The folder for Mrs. Eleonora Draytonus missing entirely." Miss Marple absorbed this information. Perhaps he had it out on his desk when he died. "That was my thought as well, but it is not there, nor anywhere else saying the office. Mr. Patterson says Mr. Ashby was most particular about filing things properly at the end of each day. He would not have taken a client file home with him, then someone removed it." Miss Marple said quietly. Constable Perkins looked uncomfortable. "That is what troubles me, Miss Marple." "But who and when?" The office was locked when Mr. Patterson arrived in the morning. Mr. Ashby had a key, naturally. "Did any?" "Only Mr. Patterson himself and Mrs. Ashby, the solicitor's sister, who lives in She has not been near the office in months." Miss Marple considered this. What a booth safe itself. Who knew the combination? Only Mr. Ashby, as far as Mr. Patterson knows. He says his employer was very particular about that. Never wrote it down. Kept it in his head. They walked together slowly along the high street. Miss Marple said, "You mentioned finding something else on the floor off the officer-torn train timetable, I believe." Constable Perkins looked surprised. "I suppose I must have mentioned that." "Yes, there was a timetable turn from yesterday's paper, from the day before Mr. Ashby died. The Dover route was marked, and a particular evening train was circled." "Dover," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "That is where the boating accident occurred, is it not? Where Mrs. Drayton supposedly drowned?" "Just so, Miss Marple, though what Mr. Ashby would want with a train schedule for Dover, I cannot say unless he was planning to go there himself," Miss Marple finished. "To make inquiries, perhaps, about the identification he had made 3 months ago." The constable nodded. "That had occurred to me as well. But if he doubted his own identification, why not simply go to why plan a journey in secret?" Miss Marple thought of the impressed letter E on the blank paper and the safe left carelessly open. She thought of Mr. Ashby, walking rapidly through the village with anxiety written across his face. "People panic, Constable," she said gently. Even careful, methodical people like Mr. Ashby, and when they panic, they rarely finish what they start, especially paperwork. She excused herself and made her way toward Bluebell Cottage, which lay at the northern edge of the village down a pleasant lane lined with hawthorns. The cottage itself was charming, with diamond-panelled windows and a thatched roof that wanted some repair. The garden showed signs of recent neglect, though Summy and Ehud made an effort to tidy the front path. Miss Marple had timed her visit for mid-morning, when she knew most people would be occupied with their daily routines. She walked past the cottage once, observing it carefully. Smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting someone was at home. A bicycle leaned against the side wall, its tires still good, but the frame showing rust. That will be Mr. Harford, she supposed. On her second pass, she paused as though to admire the late-blooming roses by the gate. From this vantage point, she could see through the front window into what appeared to be the sitting room. A man sat in an armchair reading a newspaper. Mr. Richard Harford. Presumably, he was younger than she had expected, perhaps 35, with dark hair and a lean face. His clothes were neat but inexpensive, the sort worn by a man wowed with his hands or in some modest clerical position. As she watched, he looked up suddenly, as though sensing her presence, and their eyes met through the window. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly and moved on, but not before she had observed his expression. There had been weariness, there and something else, resentment perhaps, Oranger carefully controlled. She completed her circuit of the cottage by taking the footpath that ran behind Degat. The back gate stood slightly open, and through it she could see a small vegetable patch, mostly gone towards, and beyond that a garden shed with peeling paint. What caught her attention, however, was the sitting-room window visible from this angle. Through it, she could now see Mrs. Drayton, who had apparently entered the room. She stood near the fireplace, speaking to Mr. Harford with animated gestures. Even from this distance, Miss Marple could read tension in every line of her body. Mr. Harford rose from his chair abruptly, his face darkening. He said something sharp. Mrs. Drayton took a step backward, her hand rising to her throat in a gesture thought might have been fear or merely dramatic emphasis. Miss Marple moved away before she could. Observed. She had seen enough. Whatever the relationship between the supposed widow and her nephew, it was not one of familial warmth. More like two cats forced to share the same small space, each waiting for the other to make a wrong move. She made her way back toward the village proper, her mind turning over the various pieces of this curious puzzle. Mr. Ashby had been planning a trip to Dover, the place where Eleanora Drayton had He had opened his safe in haste, and a file had gone missing. He had been found dead with the impression of the letter E on a blank paper before him. E for Eleanora, or E for something else? Miss Marple thought of the letter itself, or rather, the lack of it. If Mr. Ashby had written a letter or note beginning with E, what had happened to it? Had he destroyed it himself, or had someone else removed it along with the missing file? She recalled a case in Little Puddleton many years ago, where Eamon had written a suicide note and then changed his mind and burned it, but he had forgotten about the sheet beneath, which bore the impression of his words. That impression had eventually led to his arrest for murder, not suicide at all. The mind was such a curious thing, capable of great cleverness in some matters and profound foolishness in others. By the time Miss Marple reached her own cottage, she had formed a working theory. Mr. Ashby had discovered something that disturbed him greatly. Perhaps someone had contacted him with information, or perhaps his unconscious had finally prompted him to make inquiries. He had planned to investigate personally, had opened his safe to retrieve the Drayton file, and then something had happened to prevent his journey. That something, Miss Marple was increasingly certain, had been deliberate. Heart failure was convenient, but not always natural. There were substances that could mimic its effects methods that left little trace. Dr. Haydock was a good doctor, but he was also a busy one, and he would not look for poison where no suspicion existed. The question was whether Mrs. Drayton herself had been involved, or whether someone else had acted to protect a secret she carried. And what of Mr. Hart, who stood to lose everything if his inheritance was proven fraudulent? Miss Marple put the kettle on and settled into her favourite chair. Outside, the rain had begun again, soft and steady. She picked up her knitting, but her fingers moved automatically while her mind remained far away, picking through the threads of deception that was slowly beginning to unravel. Chapter 4. The Two Signatures, Ms. Marple had always believed that handwriting revealed character in much the same way that faces did. One could study the formation of letters, the pressure of the pen, the spacing and slant, and learn a great deal about the person who had written them. It was not an infallible science, of course, but it was a useful one. This thought occupied her mind as she sat in her parlour 2 days after the inquest, examining a collection of parish records that Thevacar had asked her to help organise. Among them were various letters and documents from parishioners, including several notes from Mrs. Eleanora Drayton dating back for years. The letters concerned mundane matters: a donation to the church roof fund, an apology for missing a committee meeting due to illness, a brief note about Theflo Arota. Miss Marple studied them carefully, noting the characteristics of the hand that had written them. The signature was particularly distinctive, bold and upright with strong vertical strokes. The capital E was formed with 3 decisive horizontal lines, the capital D with a firm loop that suggested confidence. The writing guttural had an angular quality, masculine in its directness. Miss Marple set these aside and considered what she had observed of the current Mrs. Drayton yesterday. She had managed to be present at the post office when that lady had come to inquire about redirecting her mail. The postmistress, Miss Hartley, had required her to fill out a form, and Miss Marple had been positioned at the counter in such a way that she could observe the process without appearing to stare. The handwriting had been elegant and flowing, with loops that curved gracefully and letters that leaned slightly to the right. The signature, when Mrs. Drayton had signed the form, had borne little resemblance to the bold strokes Miss Marple remembered from the old parish letters. Of course, handwriting could change over time. Illness, injury, even emotional distress could alter one's hand. But Miss Marple had seen her share of genuine change, sans deliberate disguises, and this felt like the latter. She was still contemplating this when her maid, Cherry, announced that Mrs. Drayton herself had come to call. "Show her in, please," Miss Marple said, setting Azadeth parish records and arranging her features into an expression of welcoming interest. Mrs. Drayton entered, looking pale but composed. She wore a dark blue dress that was well cut but not new, and her hat was trimmed with a ribbon that everything about her suggested a woman of modest means and good taste. "Miss Marple, I hope I am not intruding," she began. "I know we are not well acquainted, but I find myself further alone in the village at present, and I thought perhaps you might spare me a few moments. My dear Mrs. Drayton, of course, please do sit down. I shall ring for tea." Once they were settled with cups of tea and a plate of biscuits between them, Mrs. Drayton seemed at a loss for how to begin. She stirred her turn necessarily, her spoon making small clinking sounds against the china. "It isn't so very difficult," she said at last, coming back to find everything changed. "Mr. Ashby dead, my nephew installed in my cottage, all my affairs distributed as though I were truly gone. The solicitors in Much Benham, who are handling Mr. Ashby's practice, have been most unhelpful. They say these matters take time to resolve. I imagine the situation is unprecedented," Miss Marple said gently. "It cannot be easy for anyone involved." "No." Indeed, Mrs. Drayton set down her cup with a hand that trembled slightly. "And the villagers, they look at me so strangely, as though I were a ghost, or worse, an impostor." Miss Marple allowed a small pause. "That must be distressing for you, although I suppose it is natural that people should find your return remarkable. After all, Mr. Ashby was quite certain in his identification." Mrs. Drayton's fingers tightened on her cup. "He was mistaken. These things happen, do they not? Bodies that have been in the water become difficult to recognize." "Quite so. And yet Mr. Ashby had known you for several years. I understand he hard handled your late husband's estate." "Yes, that is true." Mrs. Drayton looked away toward the window where rain streaked the glass. "But we were not intimate friends. Our relationship was entirely professional." Miss Marple picked up her knitting a half-finished mitten in soft grey wool. She had found that people often spoke more freely when her hands were occupied with something else, as though the act of knitting rendered her less threatening. "I wonder," she said, keeping her tone light and conversational, "whether you have remembered more about your time on the coast, the fishing family who took you in, for instance. Surely the authorities should be informed so that these kin people can be thanked properly." A brief hesitation. "I am afraid my memory remains rather fragmentary. I remember kindness and a small cottage near the water, but the details are quite hazy. The doctors say this is not uncommon in cases of trauma, of course. How fortunate that your memory returned enough for you to find your way home. One does wonder how you managed it with no papers and, presumably, no money." Mrs. Drayton's eyes met hers, and for a moment Miss Marple saw something sharp and calculating behind the facade of a bewildered gentility. "I had hidden some money in the lining of my Cota Small Emergency Fund. It was enough for the train fare." "How very prudent of you," Miss Marple said. She paused, then added, "Although I confess, I am curious about one small thing. When you signed the form at the post office yesterday, I could not help but notice that your handwriting seemed rather different from what I remembered. Not that I make a study of such things, you understand, but I do recall your note about the flower rota being quite distinctive." The room seemed to grow very still. Mrs. Drayton's face had gone rigid, like a mask that had been carefully painted and might crack at any moment. "My memory loss," she said finally, her voice carefully controlled. "It affected many things. The doctors explained that sometimes, when the mind recovers from such trauma, certain patterns are altered, including one's handwriting." "How very interesting," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking softly. "I once knew a woman in Much Benham who suffered a stroke. Her handwriting changed entirely, became quite killed. But yours has not become simpler, you see. It has become more elaborate, almost as though you, Lanetto, write in a different country with different conventions." The words hung in the air between them. Mrs. Drayton set down her teacup and rose to her feet with stiff dignity. "I did not come here to be interrogated, Miss Marple. I came seeking the kindness of a neighbor, and you have it, my dear," Miss Marple said, looking up at her with eyes that were bad, gentle and unrelenting. Kindness does not require me to ignore what I observe. You see, I notice things. It is a habit of long standing, and what I notice, Mrs. Drayton, is that you are not quite who you claim to be. Mrs. Drayton's hand went to her throat, a gesture Miss Marple had seen her make before when agitated, when she spoke. Her carefully maintained English accent had slipped ever so, revealing beneath it the faintest trace of something else, something that might have been French. "You're mistaken," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "but I think not. You see, I have been thinking a great deal about poor Mr. Ashby, about why he might have died so suddenly, just as you returned to St. Mary. Mead, about why his safe was left open and a file gone missing, about why he had been planning a trip to Dover. Nothing about any of that. No, but you knew Mr. Ashby. You visited his office the evening before he died, though you claim he was not there. And yet someone saw him walking through Theveledge at 8 o'clock that night, looking deeply troubled. One wonders what could have troubled him so greatly." Mrs. Drayton moved toward the door, her composure crumbling. "I must go. This conversation is most unpleasant." "Of course," Miss Marple said, "but before you do, might I offer a small piece of advice? The truth, my dear, has a way of emerging eventually like a seed buried in the ground. It pushes upward toward the light, no matter what obstacles are placed in its way. Better to acknowledge it early than to let it destroy everything when it finally breaks through." Mrs. Drayton left without another word, her footsteps quick and uneven on the path outside. Miss Marple set down her knitting and moved to the window. She watched the woman hurry away toward Bluebell Cottage, her shoulders hunched against rain that had begun to fall more heavily. The French accent had been slight, barely noticeable, but it had been there. Miss Marple thought of the sophisticated perfume she had detected in the village shop, of the new shoesand, new gloves, of handwriting that had changed from bold and English to flowing and continental. She thought too of the photographs Richard Harford had in his cottage theons, showing Eleonora Drayton on the Brittany coast with a woman who looked remarkably like her sister, perhaps, or a cousin. Miss Marple had once known two sisters in her youth, Mary and Margaret Laurent. They had been so alike that even their own mother sometimes confused them. Margaret had been the respectable one, Mary the wild one who had run off to Paris when Margaret died unexpectedly. Mary had returned and attempted to claim her sister's property by pretending to pay her. It had taken several months to uncover the deception, and by then considerable damage had been done. History, Miss Marple reflected, had a persistent habit of repeating itself. Human nature remained remarkably regardless of the era or the specifics of the situation. Greed, fear, desperation, these were timeless motivations that led people to attempt the same frauds generation after generation. The question now was what to do with her suspicions. She had no proof, nothing that would satisfy a court of law, only observations, small inconsistencies, and a lifetime often standing how people behaved when they were hiding something. But proof, Miss Marple knew, had a way of presenting itself to those who looked carefully enough, and she intended to look very carefully indeed. Chapter 5. Tea at the Bluebell Cottage. The following afternoon brought one of those unexpectedly mild autumn days that Madeone forget winter was approaching. The sun emerged from behind the clouds with an almost apologetic brightness, and Miss Marple decided it was the perfect opportunity to pay a call on Mr. Richard Harford at Bluebell Cottage. She armed herself with a jar of her homemade damson jammer, useful social prop that provided both an excuse for the visitant, something to occupy her hands should the conversation prove awkward. People were generally more forthcoming when presented with small gifts, she had found. It lowered their defenses in subtle ways. The walk to Bluebell Cottage took her past the church, where she paused to speak briefly with the vicar's wife about the upcoming harvest festival. Mrs. Clement from the village shop was putting out fresh vegetables, and they exchanged pleasantries, a booth's weather. All very normal, very ordinary, the gentle rhythm of village life that Miss Marple knew so well. And yet beneath that ordinary surface, something decidedly irregular was unfolding. When she reached Bluebell Cottage, she found the front gate newly oiled and the path swept clean. Someone had been making efforts at maintenance, though the garden itself still showed signs of neglect. From the months when the cottage had stood empty between Eleonora Drayton's suppositith and her nephew's arrival, Mr. Hop answered her knock almost immediately, as though he had been near the door. He was younger than she had thought, when glimpsing him through the window perhaps. No more than 32 or 33, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that assessed her with sharp intelligence. "Mr. Harford, I am Miss Marple from the village. I hope I am not calling at an inconvenient time." He hesitated, clearly weighing whether to turn her away, then apparently decided that would appear suspicious. "Not at all, Miss Marple, please come in." The cottage's interior was neat, but impersonal as though no one had quite settled into living there. A few masculine touches suggested Mr. Herford's occupancy. A pipe on the mantelpiece, a newspaper folded on the side table, but the furniture and decorations remained as they must have been during Mrs. Drayton's residence. Watercolors of English countryside scenes hung on the walls, and china figurines occupied the shelves. "I brought you some jam," Miss Marple said, offering a jar, a small welcoming gift, "though I realize your circumstances here are rather unusual at present. Thank you." He took the jar with the automatic courtesy of someone raised to observe proper forms. "Please sit down. May I offer you tea?" "That would be most kind." While he busied himself in the kitchen, Miss Marple took the opportunity to observe the room more carefully. The bookshelf particularly drew her attention. Most of the volumes were what one might expect in a modest English cottage novels by Mrs. Gaskell and the Brontë sisters. Some volumes of poetry, a few travel guides, but tucked among them were several photograph albums. And Miss Marple, with the casual curiosity of an elderly lady, rose to examine them more closely. The photographs told an interesting story. Here was Eleonora Drayton, unmistakably the same woman whose image had appeared in the parish newsletter years ago. But in these holiday photographs taken on what appeared to be the French coast, she was not alone. Standing beside her, laughing into the camera, was another woman who might have been her twin, the same strong features, the same build, though this second woman had a vivacity in her expression that, rather reserved, Eleonora Drayton had lacked. "My aunt enjoyed travelling," Mr. Harford said from the doorway, a tea tray in his hands. His voice was carefully neutral, but Miss Marple detected tension beneath it. "How lovely," Miss Marple said, turning with a pleasant smile. "And what a friend from her travels." "Her sister?" The words came reluctantly. "Isabel, they spent summers together in Brittany when they were younger. How nice to have such a close relationship." "And does Isabel still live in France?" Mr. Harford set down the tray with hands that were not quite steady. "I believe so. We were not a close family, Miss Marple. My aunt and I had little contact until her death." He stopped correcting himself until her supposed death. And now this entire situation is impossibly awkward. Imogen, it must be, Miss Marple said, accepting her teacup. You inherited everything, I understand, and now find yourself in the awkward position of potentially having to return it all. Potentially. He sat down across from her, his jaw tight. Though I confess, I have my doubts about the woman who has returned. She seems different from the aunt I knew. This was interesting. Miss Marple sipped her tea and said, different in what way? Small things. Her manner of speaking, her gestures, the way she holds herself. My aunt was quite reserved almost, rigid in her propriety. This woman is more. He searched for the word. More emotional. Trauma can change people, Miss Marple suggested gently. Nearly drowning, losing one's memory, living among strangers. It would affect anyone, perhaps, he said, but he did not sound convinced. He drank his tea in quick, agitated sips. The truth is, Miss Marple, I never wanted this cottage, or her money. I work as a clerk in London, or I didn't till I received word of the inheritance. I came here out of obligation, nothing more, and now she returns, making accusations, suggesting I somehow engineered her death. Has she made such accusations? Not in so many words, but the implication is there. She looks at me as though I am a usurper, when all I did was accept what was legally left to me. Miss Marple set down her cup. Mr. Harford, may I speak plainly? I am an elderly woman who has seen a great deal of life, and I've developed certain instincts about when things are not quite as they seem. He looked at her warily. Go on. The woman who has returned may or may not be your aunt. But someone killed Mr. Ashby, despite what the inquest concluded on, that someone had a reason connected to Mrs. Drayton's supposed death and resurrection. You think it was murder? His face had gone pale. I think it was very convenient that Mr. Ashby died just as questions were being raised about his identification. He was planning to go to Dover, to investigate him. Then he died before Heckle make that journey. Mr. Harford stood up abruptly and moved to the window, his back to her. What do you want from me, Miss Marple? The truth, if you know it, or your cooperation in discovering it if you do not. A long silence. Then he said, without turning, I met her once before, for the woman who has returned. It was years ago at a family gathering. She was introduced as Isabel, my aunt's sister. They looked remarkably alike, but Eleonora always insisted they were not twins, merely close in age. And you believe the woman here now is Isabel, not Eleonora? I do not know what I believe. He turned to face her, and his expression was that of a man caught between conflicting loyalties and fears. But I will tell you this. When she first arrived at this cottage and found me here, she was angry, yes, but not surprised. It was as though she had expected to find me in residences, though she knew about the inheritance beforehand. That is most significant, Miss Marple said quietly. There is something else. He returned to his chair, leaning forward with his hands clasped between his knees. Eleonora wrote to Miss Shartley before her death. Just a brief note saying she was going to Dover for a few days. Some business to attend to. She asked me to water her plants if she did not return by a certain date. I thought it an odd thing to write, but I was in London and could not help in any case. Do you still have this letter? I burned it after I heard of her death. It seemed too painful to keep. Miss Marple absorbed this a trip to Dover, the very place where the body had been. Had Eleonora Drayton gone there to meet her? sister, or had Isabel lured her there for some darker purpose? Mr. Harford, you said you and your aunt were not close yet. She left you everything. Did that surprise you? Utterly. We had perhaps exchanged a dozen letters in as many years, but she had no other family, or none that she... I suppose I was the only option, unless, Miss Marple said carefully, she had planned to change her will. Perhaps that was the business she meant to attend to in Dover, meeting with a different solicitor away from Mr. Ashby's oversight. The colour drained from his face. Then someone would have had the reason to prevent that change. Indeed, he stood up again, pacing now. Miss Marple, I swear to I knew nothing of any scheme. The inheritance was as much a shock to me as to anyone, and I certainly did not kill Mr. Ashby. I believe you, Miss Marple, said Anne. The young man's distress seemed genuine, his confusion authentic. But I think you may be in danger none the less. If there is a conspiracy, and if the conspirators believe you know something that could expose them, they may act to silence you. What should I do? Trust no one, not even the woman who claims to be your aunt. And if you remember anything else, any detail that seems significant, please come to me immediately. She rose to leave, and escorted her to the door. As she stepped outside into the mild afternoon, she glanced back at him. One more thing, Mr. Harford. The photographs of your aunt with her sister, when were they taken? The dates are written on the back. Let me check. He retrieved one of the albums and examined a photograph. This one says, August 1952, 3 years ago. 3 years ago, when both sisters were alive and together in France, and now one was dead and the other was playing a dangerous game in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple walked slowly home, her mind turning over these new pieces of information. The pattern was becoming clearer, like a photograph emerging in a developing tray. But there were still gaps, still questions that needed... Most pressingly, she needed to discover what had really happened in Dover 3 months ago, and why Mr. Ashby had been silenced before he could reveal the truth. Chapter 6. The note in the desk drawer. Miss Marple had always found that the most revealing discoveries often came not from dramatic confrantions, but from quiet, methodical observation. It was with this principle in mind that she made her way to Mr. Ashby's office 3 days after her illuminating conversation with Richard Harford. The office was no longer officially sealed, though young Mr. Patterson continued to work there, sorting through files and corresponding with the solicitors in Much Benham, who were taking over the practice. Miss Marple had timed her visit for late morning, when she knew Mr. Patterson would likely be out, making his rounds to the bank and post office. She climbed the narrow stairs above the chemist shop, her breathing only slightly laboured. The door to the office stood ajar, and she could see the empty room beyond, papers neatly stacked on the desk, the morning light slanting through the window. Mr. Patterson, she called softly, though she knew he would not answer. Receiving no response, she entered. It was not precisely proper, but then again, the door had been open, and she was merely an elderly lady who had become confused about whether the office was receiving visitors. The room was much as she imagined it had been on the night Mr. Ashby died. A large mahogany desk dominated the space, its surface now cleared of all but a blotter and an inkstand. Filing cabinets lined one wall, and the safe that had been found slightly open now stood firmly closed. Miss Marple moved to the desk and sat down in Mr. Ashby's chair. She had learned long ago that one could often understand a person better by seeing the world from their perspective, quite literally. From this vantage point, she could see what Mr. Ashby would have seen, the door directly ahead, the window to the left showing a view of the high street below, the safe to the right. If someone had entered while he sat here, he would have seen them immediately unless, of course, they had already been in the room. She opened the desk drawers one by one, finding them mostly empty. Mr. Patterson had been thorough in his sorting pens. Pencils, a stick of sealing wax, some stamps, the ordinary tools of a solicitor's trade. But in the bottom right drawer, pushed toward the back, her fingers encountered something that the young clerk had apparently missed, a hidden compartment, the sort that Victorian desks often possessed, cunningly concealed behind what appeared to be a solid panel. Miss Marple had seen such compartments before. Her own desk at home had one defect from her father many years ago. She pressed the panel in just the right spot, and it sprang open with a Inside lay a single sheet of paper, half burned along one edge, as though someone had begun to destroy it and then thought better of it. The handwriting was unmistakably Mr. Ashby's, single quotes as the same precise script she had seen on legal documents over the years. The note read, "She is not who she says she is. Meet me before I go to the police." It was not signed, and there was no indication of whom it was addressed to, but the message was clear enough. Mr. Ashby had discovered the deception and had intended to expose it. The question was whether this note had ever been sent or whether it had been drafted and then reconsidered. Miss Marple examined the burned edge carefully. It appeared to have been held to a flame briefly, then withdrawn. Perhaps Mr. Ashby had intended to destroy it, but had been interrupted. Or perhaps he had saved it as evidence of his own knowledge, should anything happen to him. She folded the note carefully and placed it in her handbag. It was evidence and it should rightfully go to the police. But she wanted to understand more before involving Constable Perkins, who, though well-meaning, lacked the subtlety required for this particular situation. As she rose to leave, she heard footsteps on the stairs, moving with surprising sprightliness for a woman of her years. Miss Marple stepped behind the open door just as Mr. Patterson entered. "Hello," he called. "Is someone here?" Miss Marple emerged with her most apologetic smile. "Oh, Mr. Patterson, you quite startled me. I came to inquire about some documents." Mr. Ashby was preparing for the church committee and, finding the door open, "I am afraid I wandered in. So foolish of me." Mr. Patterson, a nervous young man with a prominent Adam's apple, looked relieved. "Miss Marple, no harm done, I'm sure, though I'm afraid I cannot help you with church documents. Everything of Mr. Ashby's has been catalogued and sent to Much Benham. Of course, I should have realized." "Tell me, Mr. Patterson, you worked with Mr. Ashby for several years, did you not?" "5 years, Miss Marple." "Then you must have known his habits well, his methods of work." "I suppose I did, yes." Miss Marple moved toward the window, gazing down at the street below as though merely making conversation. "I have been thinking about the evening he died. You said he sent you home at the usual time around 6 o'clock. That is correct. And did he seem anxious or distressed?" Mr. Patterson hesitated. "Now that you mention it, he had been rather preoccupied all that day, kept checking his pocket watch as though waiting for something, and he received a telephone call in the afternoon. That seemed to disturb him." "A telephone call? Do you know who it was from?" "I answered it, but the person would not give a name, just asked to speak with Mr. Ashby urgently." A woman's voice. "I think, though I cannot be certain." This was new information. Miss Marple filed it away carefully. And after this call, Mr. Ashby's behavior changed. He became quite agitated. kept going to the safe, taking out files and putting them back. Then, around 5, he told me I could leave early. Said he had private business to attend to, and you saw no one enter the building after you. Although I only went as far as the bakery next door. I had promised my landlady I would bring home bread for supper. I was there perhaps 10 minutes sound when I came out. I saw someone leaving the building. Miss Marple's attention sharpened. Someone leaving. But you did not mention this at the inquest. Mr. Patterson looked uncomfortable. I did not think it significant at the time, and I could not be certain they had come from Mr. Ashby's office rather than chemist below, but you think now that they might have come from upstairs. It was the way they moved quickly, furtively with their hat pulled low. They went around the corner toward the church before I could see clearly, man or woman. I could not say with certainty. Average height, wearing a dark coat. It might have been either. Miss Marple thanked him and made her way down the stairs, her mind working rapidly. Someone had visited Mr. Ashby that evening, someone who had left in a hurry. Had that person been the recipient of his note, or had they been his killer, acting to prevent him from going to the police? She walked slowly toward the church, retracing the route the mysterious figure would have taken. The path led past the churchyard, then forked. One direction led toward Bluebell Cottage, the other toward the railway station. Either destination suggested interesting possibilities. When she reached home, Miss Marple made herself a pot of tea and settled into her chair with the half-burned note. She read it again, considering each word carefully. She is not who she says she is. Not he, but she, Mr. Ashby, had been referring to a woman, almost certainly the person claiming to be a Drayton. Meet me before I go to the police. This suggested the note had been meant for someone. Specific someone Mr. Ashby trusted, or at least wished to warn. But who? Richard Harford seemed the obvious choice, the heir who stood to lose everything if the fraud were exposed. But would Mr. Ashby have contacted him? Or had he sent the note to someone else, entirely someone who had reason to want the truth revealed, or perhaps to keep it hidden? Miss Marple thought of the telephone call Mr. Patterson had mentioned, a woman's voice. Urgent, demanding to speak with Mr. Ashby. Had that been the false Eleonora, trying to gauge what he knew? Or had it been someone else with a stake in the matter? She rose and went to her desk, where she kept a small address book. In it were the names and addresses of various people she had met over the years, including several who lived in or near Dover. It was time, she decided, to make some inquiries of her own. If Mr. Ashby had been prevented from investigating what had really happened in Dover 3 months ago, then she would have to do it in his stead. But first, she needed to understand the relationship between the two sisters, Eleonora and Isabel. Why had one apparently died while the other took her place? What was the benefit of such an elaborate fraud? Themes were, Miss Marple suspected, lay not just in the inheritance, which was modest by most standards, but in something else, something that made it worth killing to protect. She thought of the torn train timetable found in Mr. Ashby's office, the Dover route marked and circled. She thought of Eleonora Drayton's letter to her nephew mentioning a trip to Dover shortly before her death. And she thought of Thebedy that had been identified as Eleanor recovered from the water after several days. A body that had been wearing Eleonora's ring and bore an identifying mole on her shoulder. Details that both sisters would have The pieces were beginning to form a picture, but it was still incomplete. Miss Marple needed more information, and she needed it quickly, because if her suspicions were correct, then Richard Harford was not the only person in danger. The killer had acted once to protect their secret. They wouldn't hesitate to act again. Chapter 7. Footsteps behind the shed. The October of Ning had drawn in early, bringing with it a damp chill that spoke of winter's approach. Miss Marple, wrapped in her warmest coat and carrying a small torch, made her way along the lane toward Bluebell Cottage just as the last light was fading from the sky. She had spent the afternoon composing a letter to an acquaintance in Dover, Mrs. Fellows, who ran a boarding house near Thistlefront and had an encyclopedic knowledge of local gossip. If anyone could provide information about what had transpired 3 months ago, it would be Mrs. Fellows. But letters took time, and Miss Marple had the distinct sense that time was not a luxury they possessed. Her ostensible purpose this evening was to return a book she had borrowed from the parish lending library, which happened to take her past Bluebell Cottage. That the route also allowed her to observe the cottage and its occupants was merely coincidental. As she approached, she saw a lamp lit in the downstairs windows. 2 figures moved about inside, their shadows cast against the curtains. She could not make out details, but the gestures suggested conversion, possibly argument. One shadow was clearly that of a woman, the other a man's taller form. Miss Marple walked past the cottage slowly, her eyes adjusting to the gathering darkness. The front gate stood open slightly askew on its hinges. The path, though the door was well trodden, but to the side of the cottage near the old garden shed. The ground was softer. She paused ostensibly to adjust her scarf and, in that moment, heard voice raised inside the cottager woman's, voice sharp with anger or fear. A man's deeper tones, attempting to plead, or perhaps to argue. Then the back door of cottage opened suddenly, spilling light across the garden. Miss Marple stepped quickly into the shadow of the hedge, her heart beating rather faster than she liked. The woman emerged first, her silhouette unmistakable as that of Mrs. Drayton. She moved quickly toward the garden shed, her coat pulled tight around her. Behind her came Richard Harford, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "You cannot simply demand that I leave. This is legally my property until the courts decide otherwise. The courts will decide in my I am Eleonora Drayton." The identification was a terrible mistake, nothing more. Then why did you not contact the authorities immediately upon recovering your memory? Why come here first, speaking to no one official? A pause. Then Mrs. Drayton's voice, lower, almost threatening. "There are things you do not understand, Mr. Harford. Things it would be better for you not to inquire about too closely." "Is that a threat?" "It is advice." Mr. Ashby asked too many questions, and look what happened to him. Miss Marple's hands tightened on her handbag. That was as close to a confession as made no difference. The implication was clear, the threat barely veiled. Richard Harford response was equally telling. "Are you saying you had something to do with his death?" "I am saying that curiosity can be dangerous. Now I need something from the shed, and then I suggest you retire for the evening. We will speak again tomorrow when you have had time to reconsider your position." She moved toward the shed, and Harford, after Ammerman's hesitation, turned back toward the cottage. The door closed behind him, leaving Mrs. Drayton alone in the darkness. Miss Marple remained motionless in her shadowed spot by She watched as Mrs. Drayton opened the shed door and disappeared inside. A moment later, a faint light purred us, though from a candle or small lamp. What could the woman be searching for in a garden shed at this? Tools. Perhaps, though, that seemed unlikely. More probably something hidden, something she did not wish Harford to know about. Miss Marple was considering whether to move closer when she heard a second set of footsteps. These came from the direction of the village, heavy and slightly uneven, as though the person was tired or perhaps limping. She crossed herself further into the hedge as the figure came into view. It was a man, though in the darkness she could not make out his features. He moved with purpose toward the shed, then stopped a few feet from it as though listening. The light inside the shed moved, and Mrs. Drayton emerged carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She started violently when she saw the man stand in. "You startled me," she said, her voice sharp. "You should not be here alone." The man's voice was unfamiliar to Miss Marple, though there was a mething in the accent that suggested he was not local to St. Mary Mead. "I can take care of myself. Can you?" Ashby thought the same, and now he is dead. Another pause, heavy with implication. Then Mrs. Drayton said that was unavoidable. He was going to perceive wraithing. And now the old woman is asking questions, the one who knits and watches everything. Miss Marple felt a small chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. They were speaking of her. "Miss Marple is harmless," Mrs. Drayton said, though she did not sound entirely convinced. "An elderly busybody with too much time on her hands. Harmless people do not notice her things she has noticed." She spoke to Harford, asked about the photographs. She visited Ashby's office. She is putting the pieces together. Then perhaps she needs to meet with an accident of her own. The words were spoken casually, almost conversationally, but their meaning was. Miss Marple remained perfectly still scarcely breathing. "That would draw too much attention," the man said. "Better to finish what we started and leave quickly. Do you have what you need?" Mrs. Drayton clutched her bundle more tightly. "Everything is here, but I cannot leave until the inheritance is secured." That was the agreement. The agreement was made before Ashby became suspicion had to be dealt with before the nephew started. Asking questions before that meddling old woman began investigating. "The situation has changed. We stay with the plan." Mrs. Drayton's voice had taken on a harder edge. "I did not come this far to leave with nothing, and I did not come this far to hang for murder." They stood facing each other in the darkness, to figures locked in some private battle of wills. Then the man turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy and dragging slightly as they had been when he arrived. Mrs. Drayton remained by the shed for a moment longer, then returned to the cottage, the bundle still clutched in her arms. Miss Marple waited several minutes before moving, during that both figures had truly gone. Then, with the aid of her small torch, she made her way cautiously to the area near the shed where the confrontation had taken place. The ground was soft from recent rain, and the impressions of footsteps were clearly visible. To sets, just as she had heard, one small and light shoes, narrow and pointed in the fashion worn by women, the other, significantly larger and heavier, with a distinctive drag mark on the right foot, as though the person favored that leg or wore a shoe with an uneven sole. Miss Marple knelt with some difficulty to examine the prints more closely. In the beam of her torch, she noticed something else, a small fragment of fabric caught on a rough edge of the shed's wooden wall. She teased it free carefully. It was good quality, and it matched exactly the color of the coat Richard Harford had been wearing when she visited him. But Richard Harford had gone inside the cottage before the second person arrived. This fabric must have come from an earlier visitor, else there had been 3 people near the shed tonight, not 2. She searched the area more thoroughly and found additional footprints, these belonging to a third person. The prints were fresher than the others, overlaying them in places, and they led not toward the cottage, but away from it toward the back lane that ran behind the gardens. Someone had been here recently, watching and listening, just as she had been. Bootwo, and what had they heard? Miss Marple made her way slowly home, Hermond working through the implications of what she had witnessed. Mrs. Drayton was clearly not working alone. The man who had met her, whoever he was complicit in the fraud, and quite possibly in Mr. Ashby's murder. His mention of finishing what we started suggested they had planned this for some time. But what was in the bundle Mrs. Drayton had retrieved from the shed? And why had she needed it now tonight with such urgency? More pressingly, Miss Marple needed to consider her own safety. The casual discussion of arranging an accident for her had been chilling in its matter-of-factness. These were people who had killed once and would not hesitate to kill again. She locked her door carefully that evening and checked that her windows were secure. Then she sat down at her desk and wrote a detailed account of everything she had observed and overheard, sealing it in an envelope addressed to Constable Perkins with instructions that it should be a punt if anything untoward happened to her. It was a precaution she hoped would prove unnecessary, but Miss Marple had not survived to her age by being careless when danger threatened. As she prepared for bed, she thought about the fragment of blue fabric and the 3 sets of footprints near the shed. Someone else was watching Bluebell Cottage, someone who had been there after the confrontation between Mrs. Drayton and her mysterious confederate. That person, whoever they were, might prove to be either an ally or anything. But one thing was certain, the situation was coming to a head, and when it did, the truth would finally emerge. She only hoped it would emerge before anyone else died. Chapter 8. The Necklace in the Hearth. Miss Marple did not sleep particularly well that night. Her mind turned over the events by the garden shed, like a kaleidoscope beach, rotation revealing new patterns and possibilities. By morning, she had reached certain conclusions that required verification, and verification meant another visit to Bluebell Cottage. The opportunity presented itself sooner than expected. Shortly after breakfast, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Drayton on High Streeting, urging from the chemist shop with a small parcel. "Good morning, Mrs. Drayton," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I trust you are settling back into village life." The woman's face remained composed, but Miss Marple detected wariness in her eyes. "As well as can be expected, Miss Marple. It is all rather overwhelming. I can imagine. I wonder, my dear, if I might call upon you this afternoon. I have been sorting through some old parish records, and I came across some correspondence from you about the church fete several years ago. I thought you might like to have it for your own records." It was a transparent excuse, but refusal would appear suspicious. Mrs. Drayton hesitated only briefly before agreeing. "Of course, shall we say 3 o'clock? "Perfect. I shall look forward to it." Miss Marple spent the intervening hours in careful preparation. She gathered several genuine letters from parish files, ensuring her pretext had some basis in fact, but more importantly, she reviewed everything she knew about the case, arranging the facts in her mind like pieces on a chessboard. At precisely 3 o'clock, she arrived at Bluebell Cottage carrying a folder of correspondence. Richard Harford and Soreth, Dor looking tired and somewhat dishevelled. "Miss Marple, my aunt, is expecting you. Please come in." The sitting room was warmer than on her previous visitor, fire burning cheerfully in the hearth despite the mildness of the day. Mrs. Drayton sat in the armchair nearest the fire, her hands folded in her lap with studied composure. "How kind of you to bring those letters," she said, gesturing to a chair. though I confess I remember very little about church fates from that period. Memory is such a curious thing, Miss Marple observed, settling herself and noting that Mr. Harford had retreated to a chair in the corner, as though positioning himself to observe rather than participate. Some things remain vivid while others fade entirely. I myself can recall with perfect clarity a summer garden party from 50 years ago, yet I cannot remember what I had for breakfast last Tuesday. She opened her folder and withdrew several letters, spreading them on the small table between them. As she did so, her eyes took in the details of the room with the practiced observation of long habit. The hearth had been swept very recently, she noticed, to clean, really, for a fireplace in regular use. Not a single ash or coal fragment marred the bricks around, and the fire irons, clean as dust, though freshly polished. "Here we are," Miss Marple said, indicating one of the letters. "Your note about donating preserves for the tea tent. Such a generous contribution." Mrs. Drayton glanced at the letter with barely concealed indifference. "How nice." Miss Marple allowed a small silence to develop as she sorted through the remaining correspondence. During this pause, she observed Mrs. Drayton's hands. They were restless, picking at a thread on her dress, smoothing her skirt, never quite still, the hands of someone under considerable strain. "I was admiring your fire," Miss Marple said conversationally. "So cozy on these autumn days, though. You must have cleaned the hearth quite thoroughly this morning." "It is spotless." A flicker of something crossed Mrs. Drayton's face. "I cannot abide mess. A clean hearth is essential. Indeed, I am the same way myself, thou. Confess I am not as diligent about it as I should be. My knees, you know, bending down to sweep out ashes is rather difficult at my age." She rose from her chair, moving as though to warm her hands by the fire, and doing so positioned herself where she could see into the hearth more clearly. The ashes had been thoroughly disturbed, as though something had been burned very recently, and then the remnants carefully removed, but not quite carefully enough. Caught in a crack between two hearthstones was a small piece of metal, partially blackened, but still recognizable as silver. Miss Marple bent down with some difficulty, ostensibly to adjust the fire screen, and in that movement managed to dislodge the fragment, so that it fell onto the bricks around where she could see it more clearly. It was part of a chain, delicate and fine, and attached to it was a tiny letter D, the sort one might find on a monogrammed necklace. "Oh dear," Miss Marple said, retrieving the fragment. "Something seems to have fallen into your fire. How unfortunate." She held it out. Then Mrs. Drayton's single quotes S face went perfectly still, like a painted mask. "I have no idea what that. Some old piece of jewelry, I suppose. The cottage had been empty for months before Richard arrived. It might have been there for years. Perhaps," Miss Marple said, examining the fragment more closely. "But silver tarnishes, you know, when exposed to air over time. This piece seems relatively untarnished, suggesting it was not in the ashes very long before being burned." She looked at Mrs. Drayton with eyes that were gentle but utterly penetrating. "I have seen such necklaces before. They were quite popular some years ago. Young women would wear them with their initials, often gifts from family. Eleonora Drayton wore such a necklace, if I remember correctly, and noticed it in several photographs." The silence in the room had grown thick and heavy. Richard Harford had risen from his chair and now stood watching the exchange with dawning comprehension on his face. "Why would anyone burn a necklace?" Miss Marple continued, her tone still pleasant and conversational, "unless, of course, It represented evidence that the person wearing it now was not the person who had originally owned it. Mrs. Drayton stood abruptly. "I think you should leave, Miss Marple. Your imagination is running away with you, is it?" "I think not. You see, I have been considering this situation very carefully. A woman returns from the dead, but she is not quite right. Her handwriting has changed. Her accent slips occasionally. Her shoes are too new for someone who has survived a shipwreck. And now I find she has burned a necklace that would have borne the initials ED. Those could be anyone's initials. True, but combined with everything else, it forms rather a damning pattern. The real Eleanora Drayton wore that necklace constantly. It appears in every photograph I have seen of her. But you are not wearing it now, are you? Because you cannot wear it, because it does not belong to you." Richard Harford stepped forward. "Miss Marple is right, is she not? You are not me, Aunt. You are Isabel, her sister." The woman's composure finally cracked. Her face, which had maintained its pleasant mask through everything, suddenly hardened into something colder and more calculating. "You cannot prove anything. A fragment of silver means nothing." "Perhaps not be itself," Miss Marple agreed. "But combined with the other evidence, it is quite suggestive. The missing file from Mr. Ashby's office. For instance, Imogen, it contained documents that would have exposed the fraud. Birth certificates, perhaps. Or letters that referenced both sisters. Mr. Ashby discovered the truth, did he not? And that is why he had to die. You're a foolish old woman making wild accusations, am I? Then perhaps you can explain the conversation I overheard last night, near the garden shed with your accomplice, the man who helped you plan this fraud and who helped you silence Mr. Ashby when he became suspicious." For the first time, genuine fear showed in the woman's eyes. "You were there. I was, and I heard everything. Your threats against Mr. Hart, your admission that Mr. Ashby's death was necessary, and your discussion of what to do about my own inconvenient questions." Richard Harford looked. "She threatened you, Miss Marple." "Not in so many words, but the implication was clear enough. I have taken precautions, of course. I have written down everything I know and left it with instructions that it should be opened if anything happens to me. So any accident I might suffer would only servato confirm my suspicions." The woman who was not Eleanora Drayton sank back into her chair, her face ashen. "What do you want?" "The truth," Miss Marple said simply, with a hand to Eleanora Drayton. "Where is she now?" A long pause. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "She is dead. She died in France 6 months ago. I was with her at the end, and you saw an opportunity. She had everything, the cottage, the money, a respectable English life, and I had no. We looked so alike. Everyone always said so. It seemed simple in auto. Take her place. But Mr. Ashby identified a body 3 months ago. Whose body was it?" The woman's hands trembled. "I do not know her name. A woman from the village, near where Eleanora died. She had no family, no one who would miss her. It was arranged by your accomplice, the man I heard last night." No answer, but the truth was written clearly on her face. Miss Marple looked at Richard Harford. "I think, Mr. Dotter, it is time to summon Constable Perkins and, perhaps, Dr. Haydock as well. There are questions about Mr. Ashby's death that need to be reconsidered." As Richard Harford left to fetch the constable, Miss Marple remained seated, watching the woman who had tried so desperately to be someone she was not. There was something almost pitiable about her now, all pretense stripped away. The dead rarely return, my dear, Miss Marple said softly. But greed always does. That is the tragedy of it all. Chapter 9. The Woman at the Station. Constable Perkins arrived within 20 minutes, his face grave as he listened to Miss Marple's account of what she had discovered. Dr. Haydock came shortly after. Summoned by Richard Harford, with the news that Mr. Ashby's death might not have been natural after all. Isabel, for that was clearly who she was, in rigid silence as Miss Marple explained about the burned necklace, the overheard conversation, and the accumulating evidence of fraud. She neither confirmed nor denied the accusations, merely stared at the cold hearthers, though seeking answers in the I shall need to take a formal statement, Constable Perkins said, looking rather out of his depth with such a complicated matter. We will need to contact the authorities in Dover. If what Miss Marple says is true, there's been a grievous misidentification of her body and possibly murder. Possibly, Dr. Haydock interjected. I would say certainly, given what we I examined Ashby myself and found no obvious signs of foul play. Booty was not looking for poison. If someone administered something that mimicked heart failure, I might well have missaid it. Could you have? Miss Marple asked with interest. Digitalis, If it were the right substance, digitalis, for instance, would be nearly impossible to detect without specific testing. It affects the heart, causes symptoms identical to heart failure, and is readily available to anyone. With access to a garden, Miss Marple nodded. Slowly, foxglove grew in many gardens, several in St. Mary Mead. Extracting its poison would require some knowledge, but not an impossible amount. The question, she said, is who administered it. Isabel claims she visited Mr. Ashby's office that evening but found him absent. Yet someone was there, someone Mr. Patterson saw leaving in haste. Isabel finally spoke, her voice flat and defeated. It was not me. I went to his office at 6 o'clock, just as I said. The door was locked and no one answered. I returned to the cottage. And your accomplice? Miss Marple asked gently. The man who met you at the shed, where was he that evening? Silence. You see, Miss Marple continued, I think Mr. Ashby made a terrible mistake 3 months ago when he identified that body as Eleonora Drayton, but it was not an innocent mistake. Someone paid him to make the false identification, or perhaps threatened him into it, and when his conscience finally troubled him enough that he planned to go to Dover and investigate, that someone had to stop him. Constable Perkins had taken out his notebook and was scribbling. Furiously, Miss Marple, suggesting Mr. Ashby was complicit in the original fraud. I am suggesting he was coerced, perhaps threatened, perhaps bribed, but I believe he knew the body was not Eleonora Drayton's, even as identified it as such. Dr. Haydock frowned. But Ashby was a respectable manor pillar of the community. Why would he participate in such a scheme? Fear, perhaps, or blackmail? I've been thinking about the note I found in his desk, the one that said, "She is not who she says she is." He was planning to make amends, to expose the truth before it was too late. But someone ensured it was already too late. Miss Marple turned to Isabel. Who is your accomplice? Who helped you plan this fraud? And who killed Mr. Ashby to protect it? I will not tell you. Then perhaps I can discover it myself. You see, I noticed something interesting about the footprints by the shed. The man who met you walks with his distinctive drag toe, his right foot. It is quite recognizable once one knows to look for it. She paused, allowing this to sink in. I think a visit to the railway station might prove illuminating. Someone who travels frequently between here and Dover, perhaps someone who has connections in France where Eleonora died, who could arrange for a body to be placed in the water and identified. Richard Harford, who had been listening with growing horror, suddenly spoke. There is a man who comes to the village. I have seen him watching the cottage. He spoke to me once, asked questions about my aunt. He said he was an old friend of the family. Did you notice anything distinctive about him? Miss Marple asked. He walked with a limp, the right leg, I think. Miss Marple smiled, though there was no warmth in it. Then, I believe we should pay a visit to the station. If this man has been travelling between St. Mary Mead and Dover, the station master will remember him. People with distinctive gaits are easily recalled. They made an odd procession walking to the railway station, Miss Marple with her steady, measured pace, Constable Perkins looking determinedly official, Dr. Haydock muttering about poison and misdiagnosis, and Richard Harford still pale with shock at how thoroughly he had been deceived. Isabel remained at the cottage under the supervision of Mrs. Dr. Clement, who had been summoned for the purpose and who was absolutely thrilled to be involved in such dramatic events. The station master, Mr. Hedges, was a genial man who took pride in knowing every passenger who came through his small station. When Miss Marple described the man they sought, his face lit up with recognition. Oh yes, I know exactly who you mean. Comes through once or twice a week, sometimes more. Always takes the Dover train, returns the same day or the next. Walks with a pronounced limp, uses a stick sometimes. Has he been here recently? Constable Perkins asked. Not for a few days, but he was here the evening Mr. Ashby died. I remember because he took the late train, the 8:15 to Dover, seemed in quite a hurry. Miss Marple felt a small thrill of satisfaction. The pieces were falling into place with gratifying precision. Do you know his name? She asked. Never gave one that I heard. Always paid cash for his tickets. Never used the booking office. But I did overhear him speaking once while he waited on the platform. Foreign accent, French, I think. He was talking to someone about arranging passage across the channel. Passage for what? Dr. Haydock asked. I could not say for certain, but he mentioned cargo that needed to be handled discreetly. At the time, he thought nothing of it. People are always moving things about, voiding customs, duties, and the like. But the cargo had been a Bardia woman's body that needed to be transported from France to England and placed in the water off Dover, where it would eventually be found and identified as Eleonora Drayton. Was anyone with him when he travelled? She asked. Mr. Hedges thought for a moment. 3 weeks ago there was a woman. I noticed because she seemed nervous, kept looking about, as though afraid of being seen. She met him here at the station, and they took the Dover train together. That would have been about the time Mrs. Drayton returned to the village. Can you describe her? Well-dressed, brown, coat and hat, average height and build. She could have been the same lady who's been living at Bluebell Cottage, though we could not swear to it. Miss Marple nodded. So Isabel and her accomplice had travelled to Dover together. Doubt to ensure the final details of their plan were in place, but something had gone wrong. Mr. Ashby had grown suspicious, had begun to investigate, and that had necessitated his murder. Mr. Hedges, she said, if this man returns, could you send word to Constable Perkins immediately? It is most important that we speak with him. Of course, Miss Marple. Is there trouble? I am afraid there is rather serious trouble indeed. As they walked back toward the village, Miss Marple organized her thoughts. The pattern was clear now. The sequence, offense logical and inevitable. Eleonora Drayton had died in France, probably of natural causes. Her sister Isabel, desperate and seeing an opportunity, had convinced some man to help her perpetrate a fraud. They had obtained another body, transported it to England, arranged for it to be placed in the water where it would be. Then had come the delicate matter of identification. Mr. Ashby had been pressured or paid to identify the body as Ellie. Perhaps he had genuinely believed it was her at first. Perhaps he had known it wasn't, but had been forced to lie. Either way, he had participated in the. But Mr. Ashby had a conscience. As time passed, and Isabel prepared to claim her sister's identity permanently, his guilt had grown. He had planned to investigate, to go to Dover and uncover the truth, and for that he had been murdered. The question now, Miss Marple said as they approached the cottage, is where this accomplice has gone. He knows that Isabel has been exposed. He knows that I overheard their conversation. He will either flee entirely or attempt to silence those who can testify against him. Constable Perkins looked alarmed. You think he might try to harm someone? I think he has already killed once and will not hesitate to do so again if he feels cornered. We must move carefully. But even as she spoke, Miss Marple felt a prickle of unease. Something was not quite right. The accomplice had been at the cottage. Last night had argued with Isabel, had spoken of leaving quickly, yet this morning Isabel had been alone, had gone about her business as though nothing were amiss. Why had Damon not returned? Where had he gone? And more troublingly, who had left the third set of footprints near the shed? The ones that suggested someone else had been watching and listening. Miss Marple quickened her pace, suddenly certain that the danger was not past, but approaching its climax. Chapter 10. The Widow Unmasked. The sitting room at Bluebell Cottage had taken on the quality of a stage set awaiting the final act of a drama. Miss Marple had requested that everyone involved in the affair be gathered there, and Constable Perkins, recognizing that the elderly lady had unravelled more of the mystery than none else, had agreed to indulge her. Isabel sat in the armchair by the now cold hearth, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Mrs. Clement hovered Nerth Dortorn between propriety and the delicious excitement of witnessing such events. Richard Harford stood by the window, his face drawn and tired. Dr. Haydock had positioned himself near the fireplace, watching everything with professional interest. Constable Perkins cleared his throat. Miss Marple has requested this gathering to present her conclusions about the death of Mr. Ashby and the matter of Mrs. Drayton's identity. I must say it is all highly irregular, but given her contributions thus far, I believe we should hear what she has to say. Miss Marple, seated in the most comfortable chair with her knitting bag beside her, looked around the room with eyes that missed nothing. She had spent the past hour in careful thought, and now the final pieces had fallen into place with. Thank you, Constable, she began in her gentle voice. I shall try to be as clear as possible, though I fear the story is rather complicated. It begins not 3 months ago with a supposed Ronin, but much earlier in France, where 2 sisters lived quite different lives. She looked at Isabel. Eleonora Drayton was the respectable one, was she not? She had married well, lived properly, maintained all the correct social forms. But you, Isabel, you chose a different path. You remained in France, perhaps lived more freely, certainly, lived with less security. Isabel's face remained impassive, but she did not deny it. Then Eleonora's husband died, Miss Marple continued. Ange came to St. Mary Mead with her modest inheritance. She lived quietly here for 5 years, troubling no one, but she maintained contact with you. Her sister Dot, the photographs Mr. Harford showed me made that quite clear. You spent summers together in Brittany, despite your different circumstances. This is all very interesting, Dr. Haydock interrupted. But what does it have to do with Ashby's death? Patience, Dr. E. I'm coming to that. You see, approximately 6 months ago, Eleonora became ill. She traveled to France to be with her sister, perhaps knowing she was dying, and die she did in some small village on the coast. Miss Marple paused, organizing her thoughts. This presented Isabel with a problem and an opportunity. Eleonora had a cottage, some money, a respectable English identity, and Isabel, who looked remarkably like her sister, had none of these things. The temptation must have been considerable. But how did the fraud begin? Richard Harford? Surely it required more than just resemblance. Indeed, it did. It required an accomplice, someone with connections and few scruples, someone who could arrange for a body to be transported to England and placed in the water off Dover, someone who could ensure that when that body was it would be identified as Eleonora Drayton. The man with the limp, Constable Perkins said, the one the station master described. Precisely. This man whose name we do not yet know helped Isabel orchestrate the entire affair. They found another body, a woman who had deedened would not be missed. They brought her to Dover and placed her in the water. Then came the crucial part, identification. Miss Marple looked around the room. Mr. Ashby was approached, probably threatened or blackmailed. He was forced to identify the body as Eleonora Drayton Evan, though he must have had the body had been in the water several days. The features were distorted, but he swore it was her. Hennet, her ring, a mole on her shoulder, details that both sisters would have shared. But why would Ashby agree Tassac a thing? Dr. Haydock demanded. That is the question I have been pondering, Miss Marple said quietly, and I believe I have found the answer. You see, I made some inquiries, discreet ones but illuminating. Mr. Ashby had financial troubles some years ago. Nothing criminal, but in auto make him vulnerable. I suspect this accomplice knew of these troubles and used them as leverage. She drew a small breath before continuing. Once the identification was made and the body buried, the will was settled. Mr. Harford inherited everything, believing his aunt truly dead. But then Mr. Ashby's conscience began to trouble him. He started to investigate, planning a trip to Dover to uncover the truth, and that could not be allowed. So they killed him, Richard Harford said, his voice hollow. Yes, the accomplice came to his office that evening of his death. Mr. Patterson saw someone leaving the building in haste. That person had administered poison, probably digitalis, which mimicked heart failure. By the time Dr. Haydock examined the body, Mr. Ashby was dead and the cause appeared natural. Dr. Haydock looked deeply disturbed. I should have been more thorough. You had no reason to suspect foul play, Miss Marple said. The inquest verdict reflected what appeared to be the facts. But then Isabel made her grand entrance, claiming to be Eleonora, returned from the dead with a convenient case of amnesia. The timing was deliberate. With Mr. Ashby dead, there was no one to contradict her story or produce evidence against her, except the missing file. Constable Perkins interjected, the one taken from Ashby's safe. Yes, that file contained documents that would have exposed the fraud, birth certificates showing to sisters. Correspondence, perhaps Eleonora's death certificate from France. The accomplice took it when he killed Mr. Ashby. leaving the safe carelessly open. In his haste, Miss Marple picked up her knitting her needles, moving in a gentle rhythm. But Isabel and her accomplice had not counted on certain things. They had not counted on the handwriting differences being noticed or on the burned necklace leaving evidence or own an elderly lady who makes it her business to observe. The accomplice wanted to leave. Immediately, she continued, I heard him say as much by the shed, but Isabel refused. She wanted the inheritance, secured, wanted everything Eleonora had possessed. That greed has been her undoing. Isabel finally spoke, her voice bitter. You know nothing of what it is like to watch your sister have everything while you have nothing. Eleonora was always the good one, the proper one. She married money while I struggled. When she died, it seemed only fair that I should take her place. Fair. Richard Harford's voice shook with an You committed fraud, participated in murder and threatened innocent people. How is any of that fair? I did not kill Ashby, Isabel said quickly. That was not supposed to happen. He was supposed to stay quiet, to accept the money we paid him and say nothing. But his conscience would not allow it, Miss Marple said. And your accomplice saw no alternative but to silence him permanently. Tell me, where is this man now? Why has he not? Isabel's face went pale. I do not know. He was supposed to meet me this morning, but he never came. I think he has abandoned me, or been apprehended, Miss Marple said quietly. She looked at Constable Perkins. I think you will find if you check with the authorities in Dover that a man matching our description attempted to board a ferry to France yesterday evening. I suspect he was apprehended possibly on unrelated charges, possibly base. Someone informed the authorities about his activities, but who would have done that? Dr. Haydock asked. Someone who was watching the cottage last night, someone who left a third set of footprints by the shed, someone who overheard the summer conversation. I didn't, decided to act. She turned to Richard Harford. Tell me, Mr. Harford, did you leave the cottage again after returning inside last night? His face reddened. I did. I could not sleep, knowing that woman was in my home claiming rights she did not possess. I went out the back way and stood near the shed, trying to decide what to do. I heard them talking, heard everything. And then, Miss Marple prompted gently. I followed him, the man with the limp. I followed him to the station and watched him purchase a ticket to Dover. Then I telephoned the police there. Told them a man matching his description was wanted for questioning in connection with Mr. Ashby's death. I gave them his description and the time of his train. You acted to protect yourself, Miss Marple said, and in doing so, you've helped ensure justice is done. Constable Perkins stood. Miss Drayton, or rather Miss Isabella, I am placing you under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and as an accessory to murder. You will be taken to the station and charged it formally. As Isabel was led away, her composure finally breaking into tears, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to leave. Richard Harford stopped her at the door. How did you know, he asked, about the footprints? About me following him. The blue fabric caught on the shed, Miss Marple explained. It matched your coat and the third set of footprints were fresher than the others made after the conversation had ended. Someone had been listening from a different position. It seemed logical that you would want to know what was being said about your future. She patted his arm kindly. You did the right thing in the end, Mr. Harford. That is what matters. As she walked home through the village, Miss Marple reflected on the case. Two sisters, one respectable and one not. a fraud born of desperation and opportunity, a murder committed to protect that fraught, and finally exposure and justice. The dead Rarrell written, she murmured to herself, but greed always does. It was a lesson she had learned many times over the years, and one that apparently needed learning again and again. Human nature, she thought, remained remarkably consistent. The faces changed, the circumstances varied, but the essential patterns repeated themselves with predictable regularity. She reached her cottage just as the afternoon light was fading. Inside, she put the kettle on and settled into her chair with a satisfied sigh. Another mystery solved, another wrong put right. It was, she reflected, a rather good day's work for an elderly lady who was supposed to do nothing more than knit and mind her garden.